late if we need to. I'm very happy to welcome you to session 3. This is the session on an Aristotelian feminism, ? And we're very fortunate to have with us this year's Miser Fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture here at the University of Notre Dame. We have Professor Sarah Borden, who's from Wheaton College, and she's an associate professor of philosophy there, and on sabbatical this year, working on a project on Aristotelian resources for feminism. And she's already an accomplished scholar, especially in the work of Edith Stein. She has 2 published books, one already out for a few years now, entitled simply Edith Stein. That's in the Continuum Outstanding Christian Philosopher series. And she has a book forthcoming from Catholic University Press. It's in press right now. That's titled Thine Own Self, Individuality in Edith Stein's Later Writings. We are very privileged to have with us Professor Borden, and she will give her talk, and then she will field her own questions. And again, I'll let the session run a little over time if there's need, since we're starting late.
Thank you, Mary. Is the volume right on this? A little bit more? It's good? Great. It's really wonderful to be with you here today. I've enjoyed having this year at Notre Dame to work, and particularly at the Center for Ethics and Culture. And I'm grateful today to have the opportunity to share with you some of my work and to get your thoughts about how we can use Aristotle for questions that are so critical for all of us. Aristotle has been one of the most richly mined thinkers for the Christian tradition. Thomas Aquinas' synthesis of Aristotle's accounts of the natural world, with Augustine's insights into our relation with God, is an astounding and formative vision shaping so many of us. And yet Aristotle is also one of the significant philosophers contributing to the systematic disrespect and denigration of women. Aristotle not only describes women as deformed and misbegotten males, he also describes women as incapable of fully actualizing that feature most distinctive to human beings, our rationality. Aristotle is certainly not the only reason we needed the feminist movement. We should not underestimate the ways in which our societies changed since the Industrial Revolution, particularly in terms of the structure of our professional and domestic lives. Nonetheless, Aristotle and the striking dominance of Aristotelianism in the universities throughout Europe in the High Middle Ages played a role, and not an insignificant one, in encouraging a situation that called out for a feminist movement. It seems to me first that we ought to agree with Pope John Paul II in calling the feminist movement providential. There are genuine insights and progress, even if also errors, in the 20th century turn to the woman question. We ought to embrace all that is true, all that is just, and all that is loving in the feminist movement. Second, however, I do not think that our feminist task regarding Aristotle is simply one of scrubbing him clean of his misogyny. There is rather a positive use of Aristotle for feminism. The broadly Aristotelian understanding of human beings can give us important and even profound insights into the full equality of women and men and the nature of gender. Thus, I'd like to propose not simply an Aristotle who happens to be compatible with feminist concerns, but a truly Aristotelian feminism. The notion of an Aristotelian feminism, although by no means a dominant approach in feminism, does already exist in some forms, the most significant of which is Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach. Nussbaum presents a compelling and important form of feminism, drawing inspiration from Aristotle. But I think that we can go beyond Nussbaum. My aim is not to reject Nussbaum's approach, but to supplement it, in part because Nussbaum wants to remain significantly metaphysically neutral. She is thereby, I will argue, not as fully Aristotelian nor as fully feminist as she could be. It seems to me that we can and ought to be more fully Aristotelian feminists, drawing from, in particular, Aristotle's hylomorphic understanding of human beings. In doing so, we can account both for our fundamental equality and for genuine gender differences. Thus, part one will focus on Nussbaum, her version of an Aristotelian feminism, and my concern that it adopts an insufficiently robust Aristotelian metaphysic. Because her account is too metaphysically thin, she cannot, I will argue, say much substantial about our differing biology and any impact that may have. In part two, I'd like to sketch a more substantive kind of Aristotelian feminism, one drawing explicitly from Aristotle's hylomorphism, which can therefore account for both our genuine equality and true gender differences. So part one, current Aristotelian feminism, Martha Nussbaum. Martha Craven Nussbaum holds a distinguished chair at the University of Chicago. She's jointly appointed in the philosophy department, the law school, and the divinity school. She has written broadly on questions of justice, education, emotions, etc., and in nearly all of her work, Aristotle is an important source. Although a few people have described Nussbaum's position in feminism as Aristotelian feminism, she herself names it the capabilities approach, citing the most significant influences for her position as Aristotle, an Aristotelian Marx, and the economic theory pioneered by Amartya Sen of the same name. Nussbaum's capabilities approach plays a role in many of her works. I'd like to focus today on her most significant turning of it to feminism, her 2000 Women in Human Development. Nussbaum's most explicit goal in Women in Human Development is to articulate criteria for evaluating human development with a view to shaping public policy. Her project is theoretical and tied to the goal of motivating governments to adopt her proposed standards for assessing whether they adequately respect human dignity. Nussbaum thinks that development ought not to be measured in terms of gross national product, express satisfaction, or a simple distribution of resources. She thinks rather that success ought to be measured in terms of whether each citizen has the material conditions relevant and necessary for developing her capabilities. Nussbaum then makes a list of 10 of these capabilities. She includes things such as life, bodily health, development of senses, imagination and thought, development of a rich and healthy emotional life, control over one's environment, both political and material, etc. She claims in rather strong language that, quote, only a broad concern for functioning and capability can do justice to the complex interrelationships between human striving and its material and social context, end quote. Thus, she thinks that governments and international agencies ought to use capabilities and her list of 10 core capabilities as the criteria for evaluating success, and we should judge states to be just when they set the conditions necessary for each individual to meet some threshold critical for the use of each of her core capabilities, and unjust where they fail to do so. What makes Nussbaum's approach feminist is that she thinks we ought to look with special attention at the failures in reaching these goals for women. She opens her book by saying, quote, women in much of the world lack support for fundamental functions of a human life. They are less well-nourished than men, less healthy, more vulnerable to physical violence and sexual abuse. They are much less likely than men to be literate and still less likely to have free professional or technical education. Women have fewer opportunities than men to live free from fear and to enjoy rewarding types of love. In all of these ways, unequal social and political circumstances give women unequal human capacities. These are not rare cases of unusual crime, but common realities. According to the UN's 1997 report, there is no country that treats its women as well as its men, end quote. Nussbaum thinks that given the greater suffering of women across the globe, international political and economic thought should be feminist, that is, attentive to the special problems women face because of sex. This focus on global questions, on the problems faced by women in the poorest countries and the poorest regions of the wealthy countries, is, I think, one of the greatest strengths of Nussbaum's work. Suffering anywhere is an evil, and thus the oppression of middle-class women and more privileged women ought to be addressed as well. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, for example, is not simply middle-class complaining. We write what we know of, and sometimes it's necessary to develop a sufficient sense of oneself before you can advocate effectively for another. On the other hand, however, I think that it is time for Western feminism to become explicitly global, attentive to the most acute forms of suffering around the world. This has been a trend in feminism more generally, and Nussbaum's work contributes importantly to this shift. One of the things, however, that distinguishes Nussbaum's global focus from so many other contemporary forms, and one of the features making it most Aristotelian, is the way in which she articulates and defends her universalism. Nussbaum understands the list of capabilities to be relevant to each and every human being, regardless of historical or social context. She is truly interested in cross-cultural and trans-historical norms distinctive to all human beings. This universalism is not, however, a Platonism. She finds the universal structures in the particulars, and she takes the universal capabilities to express themselves in quite differing ways in different contexts. She begins her argument by looking at particular case studies, telling us the stories of two quite different women in India, and she regularly returns to particular cases and instances, and yet she does not reduce the universal to a particular. It is always instantiated differently in particular cases, but it is not thereby merely a set of particulars. Nussbaum is not setting out to discover in Platonic fashion universal norms existing outside of or inattentive to particular situations, but neither does she give up on the task of finding and articulating such cross-cultural and trans-historical norms. It seems to me right to give Nussbaum's work the title Aristotelian Feminism. Our capabilities are, in Nussbaum's hands as in Aristotle's, potencies distinctive to being human, which must be developed insofar as they are, in and through our material conditions, and they can be developed well or ill. Like Aristotle, she understands them to be universal, applicable to all human beings, even though expressing themselves in distinctive ways in differing material and cultural conditions. Many aspects of the broad content, although not all the details, are distinctively Aristotelian, while our emphasis on women and women's development can be counted as feminist. Nussbaum thus provides a model for using Aristotle in a positive way for feminist purposes. And yet, the position as a whole strikes me as nonetheless not as deeply Aristotelian nor as deeply feminist as it could be. There are likely many elements we might want to point to in making such a critique. Certainly her failure to emphasize adequately the common good or the role of more than material conditions for the development of our capacities is, for example, less than fully Aristotelian. I'd like, however, today to focus on Nussbaum's failure to be fully metaphysical, and thus failure to make greater use of Aristotle's hylomorphism. One of the great weaknesses, or at the very least missed opportunities, of Nussbaum's approach lies in her failure to use more of Aristotle. She employs Aristotle in part and quite effectively, but backs away at critical points, many of which are most centrally connected to his metaphysics. Her writing style, tacking back and forth between the particular and the universal, implies an Aristotelian rather than, for example, a Platonic epistemology. Her defense of cross-cultural and trans-historical lists of capabilities, with nonetheless attention paid to specific and quite culturally sensitive expression of those structures, presumes a hylomorphic understanding of human nature. Her regular appeal to human, in contrast to merely animal, forms of functioning, especially with her emphasis on the centrality of practical reason and, as she calls it, association, are distinctively Aristotelian. And the very notion of capabilities that can be well or ill developed builds from an Aristotelian distinction between potency and act. In all these ways, she employs elements that are part of Aristotle's hylomorphic vision of the person. But she fails, first, to acknowledge fully her use of his metaphysical view, and secondly, to use it as fully as she could. She thereby, however, misses out on resources essential, it seems to me, to treating women with dignity. This failure might be theoretically motivated perhaps by a conviction that metaphysics is not possible, or simply by her clear recognition of the substantive debate regarding what Aristotle's metaphysics actually was, or it may be more practically motivated by a desire to gain the greatest consensus. She certainly emphasizes this latter point, saying, for example, that she'd like to present the capabilities as, quote, free of a specific metaphysical grounding, and her focus, quote, requires no particular metaphysical tradition. Nussbaum is surely right that certain limited political goals can be achieved more easily if one avoids detailed metaphysical discussions, and does not require commitment to a comprehensive metaphysical view regarding human nature and human fulfillment. It is not clear, however, that if this is her goal, she has fully avoided metaphysics. Her position is not compatible with just any metaphysical view. A Hobbesian metaphysic, for example, could not fit well with the notion of potency oriented toward its fulfillment, essential to any account of capability. But I assume her point is less that any metaphysical account of the person one could possibly have would fit with the view presented, than that she thinks human beings should accept her view, at least for political purposes, regardless of their private metaphysical views. I'm not yet wholly sure such a posture is possible, but she certainly avoids a lot of areas of significant debate by avoiding more explicit metaphysical commitments. But in failing to use Aristotle's hylomorphism, more fully at least, Nussbaum has also missed the opportunity to say very much about our bodies or our differing biology. And it's not clear to me that we can have an account of true equality and full recognition of the full human dignity of women without also appropriating Aristotle's metaphysics and particularly his account of the relation between form and matter. I realize that this is a bold claim, particularly in our contemporary philosophical climate where metaphysics in general is heavily criticized, and many contemporary appropriations of Aristotle have not included appropriations of his metaphysics. I will not argue for this in full, but I'd like to briefly make three critical points. First, it seems to me that Nussbaum has smuggled in more metaphysics than she admits to us. There is implicit in her view greater metaphysical assumptions and reliance than she wishes to give the appearance of. Second, insofar as these Aristotelian elements are simply her intuitive starting points and not claims fully defended, her position is thereby made weaker. The more she would, in fact, do foundational philosophy to defend the intuitions, the better she can defend what is right in her claims. And third, and most significantly, I do not think metaphysics is dead. It is certainly true that the 500 or 600 year attempt to found philosophy, and in particular metaphysics, in propositions has failed. But it seems to me that such a project was doomed to fail. Propositions are, after all, always the result of various operations by which we discover and articulate those resulting propositions. The attempt, however creative, to found metaphysics in any set of propositions is bound to fail. But this need not mean that all foundations thereby fail. It seems to me that the phenomenologists are right to turn not to the contents of mind, i.e. various propositions, but the operations of mind. And it seems to me that a metaphysics rightly drawing from the operations of mind by which we come to know the real can be defended and avoid the weaknesses of Nussbaum's attempt to do without its aid. Such claims are, I hope, provocative. Sadly, they will have to remain here undefended. I would like instead to show how Nussbaum's Aristotelian feminism would be changed if she had been more metaphysical, adopting more fully Aristotle's hylomorphism. The challenge Nussbaum faces is that she does not have an adequate account of how to run between the two extremes of biological determinism, that is, seeing our differing bodies as simply creating our gender, and social constructionism, that is, seeing gender differences as simply the result of social forces and not tied in any significant way to biological differences. Near the end of Women in Human Development, Nussbaum says, quote, particularly in the area of sex difference, we have a great deal of evidence of cultural shaping at an early age. We cannot use such evidence to rule out a biological component in sex difference with regard to love and care. But we can point out that we are still where Mill thought we were, in absolutely no position to know what that component may be. So early and pervasive are the environmental differences, end quote. This is an interesting claim. There might be a biological component to gender, she says, but because of the role of environment, that is, various social conditioning, we are in absolutely no position to know what kind of role biology may play. And she thus justifies ignoring the biological. She makes a similar move in her 1999 Sex and Social Justice. She writes, quote, experiments that allegedly show strong gender divisions in the basic abilities have been shown to contain major scientific flaws. These flaws removed, the case for such differences is altogether inconclusive. Experiments that cross-label babies as to sex have established that children are differently handled, played with, and talked to straight from birth, in accordance with the handler's belief about the child's biological sex. It is therefore impossible at present to separate nature from culture. There may be innate differences between the sexes, but so far we are not in a position to know them any more than we were when Mill first made the argument in 1869. Nussbaum acknowledges that there may be a biological basis for certain aspects of gender. She acknowledges that our bodily differences as female and male might matter, but, she quickly says, because it is too difficult to distinguish the biological from the cultural, we cannot pursue the question of how our differing bodies might matter. Nussbaum's avoidance of questions of biological difference and its possible significance is understandable. When we claim that women and men are equal, there's a corresponding tendency to emphasize our similarities, the ways in which we are the same and thus equal. When we emphasize differences, however, and particularly differences that have any kind of innate or biological basis, there is a temptation to see one version as superior to the other, as Aristotle himself did. But in failing to take up this question of the significance of biological differences, or at least to acknowledge its import, Nussbaum has opened women up to certain kinds of abuse. If our biological differences do make any significant difference, if our differing bodies matter in any significant way, then failing to take them into account will be damaging to women. It is certainly true that overemphasizing biological differences has created unjust situations. But it is not clear that in avoiding the one form of injustice, we have avoided the opposite error. Aristotle, after all, regularly warns us to beware of two errors and not simply one. Wendy Williams has a striking article that brings the question out clearly. Williams argues that if women, as many liberal feminists have been arguing, are truly no different from men, if in all significant ways women are equal to and the same as men, then it is time for women to step up and shoulder the responsibilities as well as the privileges of an equal society. If women are truly like men, they should be treated like men. There should be no exemption of women from combat, or if reinstated, the draft, nor should there be any special treatment of pregnancy. Whatever benefits are offered to one sex ought to be offered in an equal and perhaps identical way to the other. And it strikes me that Williams is right, unless we can give an account of how women and men are both truly and fundamentally equal, and yet also different. On the surface, at least, We do, however, need to acknowledge difference. As far as I know, for example, thus far only women can carry babies. And thus the future of every human civilization depends in a significant way on the ability and the willingness of women to bear children. This difference, among others, strikes me as not insignificant. And if this difference, or any other biological difference, has an impact for our patterns of development, our tendencies for emphasis among the human faculties, our way of using the human faculties, then ignoring such an impact does not serve women well, and may in fact encourage us to act in ways ultimately undermining of the future of our civilization. It is, of course, understandable that Nussbaum and so many other feminists have downplayed biological difference. There is no doubt that things previously thought to be tied directly to biology are no longer so thought. For example, Nussbaum cites an 1871 U.S. Supreme Court case decided in support of an Illinois law prohibiting women from practicing law. Justice Bradley wrote the decision, and he says, quote, "The harmony, not to say the identity of interests and views which belong or should belong to the family institution, is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. The paramount destiny and mission of women is to fulfill the noble and benign office of wife and mother." This is a strong claim. Bradley says it is repugnant for women to work in this case, the legal field. Most people today, even women who have chosen the difficult vocation of working as full-time mothers raising children, would not claim that it is repugnant simply because they are women to pursue another field, nor that women ought in principle to be limited to the noble and benign office of wife and mother. The focus on biological difference has been precisely the concern of so many feminists. The fear, and a justified one, is that biology will become destiny. That is, if we focus on difference, if we allow differing biology, for example, to be taken too strongly into account, we will end up undermining equality, as much of our history has shown. It will be a way of eliminating professional opportunities for women and encouraging a lesser development of women's full range of abilities. My claim is absolutely not that because women can bear children and men cannot, women ought not to develop other human capacities, that there should be limits in principle on the involvement of women in the professional world, etc. But I am claiming that if there are differences of any significance between women and men, it is neither just nor feminist to fail to take these into account. We must, of course, be exceedingly careful about how we articulate those differences. But it is not progress for women, and particularly for women who must struggle on so many other fronts, to pretend that there are no differences. And it weakens all of us not to acknowledge genuine strengths and distinctivenesses where each of us has them. One thing we've surely learned from the history of medicine and psychology, among other fields, something brought out so clearly by Carol Gilligan, is that if there are points of difference between women and men, and these are not noticed and made explicit, then the models that dominate will be male or masculine ones. If there are any significant non-malleable differences between women and men, it is rarely good for any of us, and for women in particular, to ignore them. Aristotle, and in particular Aristotelian Metaphysics, with its hylomorphic understanding of the person, offers us tremendous resources for running between the dual errors of biological determinism, which overemphasizes the differences, and full social constructionism, which denies substantive differences while still affirming full and complete equality between women and men. To be very provocative, I'm not convinced that we can achieve such a feat without some form of hylomorphism. But I'll simply address the weaker thesis here, that Aristotle, despite his own avowed positions regarding women, offers us something useful for understanding both why matter matters, that is, why our differing biology, among other things, is significant, without making it determinative or reductive of the person. Part 2. A more fully Aristotelian feminism. Hylomorphism in general runs between the extremes of dualism, which understands us as composed of two distinct and separable parts, usually a body and a soul, and monism, which in contemporary times is usually some form of materialism, and understands us to be composed of a single type of thing. Hylomorphism, in contrast to both, understands us as composed of two types of principles, form or soul, and matter, which are truly distinct and following distinct lawfulnesses, but nonetheless inseparable. Thus Aristotle understands us to be not a body and a soul, but a body-soul or matter-form composite. Each principle is distinct. Our form, for example, has a distinct set of capabilities or directivenesses, making it to be a human soul rather than a llama or a beaver soul. Matter, in contrast, has no such directiveness. Qua matter. It is simply plasticity for formation. Form is the principle of unity and identity over time. It marks out the temporal pattern fit for the development of beings of our type. Form, however, although containing capacities or potencies, cannot actualize those without matter. Matter is the condition in which we grow, in which we become ourselves. Thus, for example, we develop our capacities for physical growth by eating hamburgers, apples, pepperoni pizza. Our capacities for reasoning by playing with childhood toys or trying to figure out how to best comfort someone who's been hurt, etc. Our capacities do not come ready to use, but must be developed in very particular circumstances, drawing from the resources available. Aristotle understands the quality of our formation to be tied to the fitness of the matter involved for that formation. For example, some books are just plain better for developing our capacities to think critically than others. Some stories develop our affective abilities and range more fully than others. Thus, the quality of our formation is not unrelated to the quality of the matter involved. But there is also a range of differing matter, all of which can be quite effective to help us actualize our capacities. Children can eat tofu or oatmeal, curry chicken or black-eyed peas. So also we can read the stories of Tom Sawyer or Harry Potter, play Mozart or Miles Davis. Not all matter is equally good for human formation, but there may be many different materials, all of which may be equally good for human formation. What is critical for the hylomorphist is first, the claim that formation occurs in and through matter, and second, the commitment to a temporal structure of development, and thus some kind of teleology, common to all forms of the same type, even if actualized in and through quite different matter. Thus, although our form is common, our matter is not. Although Aristotle does not explicitly make the following distinction, we can add a further distinction between at least two broad types of matter. First, I'd like to refer to biological matter, that matter critical for our bodies and our physical growth. This would include our DNA, our chromosomes contributed by the ova and sperm, our various cells and organs making up our bodies, and the food we take in order to grow and sustain ourselves physically. The second type of matter I'd like to call environmental or cultural matter. This would include the matter relevant to our more than biological development, the friendships we formed in nursery and at preschool, through which we developed our social abilities, the books we read, by which we cultivated our imagination, the games we played, by which we became able to negotiate conflict, etc. These elements are material, insofar as they are the matter through which we develop certain capacities of our form. They are that through which we become ourselves. Now, perhaps a sharp line cannot be drawn between biological and environmental matter, but I'd like to make a loose distinction between the two types Now, clearly, neither is prime matter, i.e. utterly unformed potency for formation, but they are both material in Aristotle's sense of being the matter through which we actualize our distinctively human capacities. Aristotle's general distinction between formal and material principles, particularly if we further distinguish differing types of matter, offers a powerful model for accounting for gender in a way that runs between the two extremes of biological determinism and social constructionism. It strikes me that if some form of the broadly Aristotelian hylomorphism is right, then we can account for how gender is not simply the inevitable result of our particular reproductive organs, but neither is it an arbitrary construct originating solely through various social influences. First, on the Aristotelian account, our soul is fundamentally a human one. It is qua soul, neither female nor male. Sexual and reproductive capacities are among the capacities of soul, but as a human soul, these operations are not specified beyond being sexual and reproductive. As embodied and developing in certain types of biological conditions, the individual is female. As embodied and developing in other material combinations, the individual is male. Qua form or formal principle, however, all human beings are the same and equal. They are human, and thus all capabilities are human ones, and neither female nor male. It strikes me that our differences lie not on the side of form, but on the side of matter. Our differences are material, understood in the broad sense, and not formal, and thus our differences do not undermine our equality, but rather point to differing conditions for the development of our common human capacities. Matter can, however, influence in differing ways. If we adopt the very common feminist distinction between sex and gender, that is, the distinction between being male or female and being masculine or feminine, then our biological matter determines our sex. That is, our biological matter, our reproductive organs, our particular hormones and chromosomes, determine whether we are male or female. They do not, however, determine our gender, although biological matter is relevant to gender. Insofar as gender involves the development of our higher capacities, our social abilities, behaviors, and self-understanding, gender, that is femininity and masculinity, cannot be developed from biological matter alone. Gender development is also motivated by environmental matter and the various ways in which we've been treated by others, the various images and examples we encounter, etc. Gender is thus socially malleable. Insofar as traditional understandings of gender, for example, Justice Bradley's, attempted to read gender off of our biology, they missed the absolutely critical role of environmental matter, that is, the cultural and social influences. And contemporary feminists are absolutely right to attend to and critique deformed versions of such environmental matter. On the other hand, we engage our environment as human beings, as matter-form composites. Our biological matter, that is our bodies, are genuine aspects of how we engage the world. And our differing biological matter motivates and encourages, but does not determine, different patterns and ways of developing. If the more traditional position overemphasized biological matter, many contemporary feminists have underemphasized it, focusing nearly exclusively on the role of environmental matter in gender formation. I think we have to acknowledge the role of both. Gender identity develops through both biological and environmental influences. We might make the point in more hermeneutic language. On the one hand, the feminist critique of traditionalism rightly argues that gender cannot simply be read off of our bodies in an uninterpreted way. We have to acknowledge our role, the role of society, culture, history, practices, and language in our interpretation and understanding of ourselves as sexed beings. But on the other hand, the dominant feminist approaches need to acknowledge that all interpretation is interpretation of the real. It is not merely a construction ex nihilo, but truly an understanding of the real, and among the aspects of the real is the biological. One of the distinctive points in this Aristotelian feminism is the claim that biological matter matters. It is absolutely not determinative of gender, but the distinctiveness of our differing bodies provides an influence or motive for gender development that places limits on the kind of malleability or possible effect of environmental matter on gender. Gender is fundamentally developed in our social environment, but not exclusively so. Because of the role of biological matter, because our biological matter offers particular types of encouragement and incentives, certain patterns may regularly occur. It may, for example, be intelligible by many women, given certain conditions, tend to develop certain of the human traits more quickly than most men, and vice versa. Why many women tend to be more interested in certain things than most men, and vice versa. Thus, for example, and this is really just an example, I don't know if it's true, it's just a little illustration to show how this might work. Perhaps due to the comparative lesser muscle-to-body mass ratio, women have a material condition that may encourage the development of fine motor skills, while due to greater muscle-to-body mass ratio, men have a material condition that may encourage the development of gross motor skills. I don't know whether this is true, but it does seem to me that if there are such biological features, they would play a role in gender formation, and one could not attribute gender formation solely to environmental or social factors. I'd like to make 5 qualifying points. First, some version of this claim was broadly Aristotle's tactic, but much to the detriment of women. He claimed that women develop in colder matter and thus have a harder time developing fully, thus their deformation. I want absolutely and unequivocally to avoid any such suggestion. We can, it seems to me, accept Aristotle's general claim about different biological matter conditioning slightly different patterns of development without accepting that one of those patterns is superior to the other. Difference need not mean inequitable. Second, I'd like to emphasize again, our differing bodies seem to me to offer an incentive for gender development, not a determination of it. I would like to emphasize this point very, very strongly. The claim is not that our material conditions, qua female or qua male, determine the pattern of our human development, but rather that they offer influences in combination with environmental matter, encouraging our human development in certain ways rather than others. But we may have, for all kinds of reasons to work against these incentives or have other stronger incentives for heading in different directions. 3, we are rational beings and not merely vegetative or sensitive souls. Critical to our rationality is freedom, that is, the ability, albeit not unlimited, to consider different possibilities and choose among them. We have choices in what we want to emphasize, where we turn our attention, etc. And thus an account of freedom is crucial to any understanding of gender. 4, our individual biology, even those aspects more relevant to our sex, is not simply female or male, but also individual variations on those patterns. Thus, even if we can articulate the feminine and the masculine as characteristic tendencies intelligible given our differing biological matter, these groupings would only describe the biological motivations for the most part, pointing only to general tendencies. Individuals will and ought to vary from those general patterns. Hylomorphics understand all of us as matter-form composites, and there are common general biological conditions for women which differ from those of men. The conditions are, however, merely general. The precise level of hormones, the precise chromosomal makeup, etc., will likely differ, perhaps even quite significantly. This general common biological makeup offers conditions for the development of form. It may, for example, offer an encouragement, as John Paul argues, for women to attend more to how human beings grow than men. It might offer an incentive to develop certain of our human faculties prior to others. But even if we can distinguish more feminine and masculine patterns based on biological incentives, these descriptions are only for the most part and contain a great deal of legitimate flexibility. 5. The matter significant for our gender development is not simply biological. It is also cultural and environmental. Images and gendered ideals of our culture, the behavior and attitudes of our parents, our friends, our teachers, the particular toys we played with, etc., will all be significant influences for our gender development. It is not unimportant for someone's understanding of femininity, for example, that all the doctors she met as a child were male and the nurses were female, or that she ran to her mother for comfort and her father was the disciplinarian, etc. Gender on this account is in part socially constructed. That is, the matter involved is environmental as well as biological. And because of the significance of environment, gender is malleable. We can change our understanding of the feminine and the masculine. We can encourage girls to develop in ways that might be considered more traditionally masculine, and boys in ways considered more traditionally feminine, etc. The claim here is not that the social has no role. I want to claim the opposite. The social is absolutely central, but it's not the only factor. And thus there are limits to how much cultural matter can shape gender, even if it can do so to a high degree. Thus the claim is that our biology does not determine our gender development. It determines our sex, but not our gender. But our biology may make intelligible certain broad similarities among women in contrast to men and vice versa. It may offer limits to the type of influence social factors may have, but our biology does not require that all women, or any particular woman, develop in characteristically feminine ways or men in characteristically masculine ways. Because of the significance of environment, as well as our individual distinct biology and our freedom, biology only offers an influence and motive for development without being a determining factor. If this account is broadly right, then we need to claim that all human beings, female and male, have the same basic human capacities, and thus the general goal of full human development is identical for women and men. We want to become fully human, developing all of our human capabilities. Our capabilities are understood here as capacities of the form, and thus all women and all men have the same human capacities. Anything properly counting as a capacity would be present in both. Matter, however, including both biological and environmental matter, is significant. It provides various incentives for the ways in which the human capacities are developed, and the significance of biology would place limits on the malleability of gender without denying the great flexibility possible in gender formation. In conclusion, why does it matter? It seems to me that one of the challenges facing feminists in general, Nussbaum included, is maintaining the full and true commitment to women's genuine human equality and dignity, fighting for the opportunity for human flourishing for women in all areas of life, while also having something substantive and helpful to say about the ways in which women's differences from men become significant. It seems to me that the two dominant feminist temptations have been either to downplay such differences, as Nussbaum and most more liberal feminists have done, or to overemphasize those differences. This overemphasis on difference has been the same temptation for both more traditional positions, such as Judge Bradley's, and radical feminists, who think that the solution is to use technology in order to overcome biology. None of these, however, strike me as satisfying answers. Each runs the risk of overemphasizing that which is only an aspect of the truth. I want instead the whole truth. And thus it is time to return to Aristotle and find in his broad metaphysical principles an understanding of us that can be truly feminist. This does not yet, of course, answer Nussbaum's question of how we distinguish that which is more biological from that which is more environmentally motivated, but it does call us more fully to the task of doing so and provides a metaphysical model of the person capable of handling with nuance the various factors relevant to answering these questions. Thank you.
broadly agree with you, but I'm having questions in two areas here. One is, I'm troubled by your use of, it doesn't seem to me Aristotelian at all, environmental matter. Maybe what you're saying would go through just as well if you said influences or cultural practices. I don't like the term matter there. I don't know whether that's important to your argument. And secondly, I'm not quite sure, you talk about the biology sort of providing incentive or inclining it. I don't know that you've shown it. There could not at least be some different actual capacities. I mean, some of the research that's been done on the brain, and certain. I just got this book. I haven't read it yet, but spatial perception or mathematical ability. I know it's hot topics, but it's. I mean, I like your account of the importance of biology, contra a lot of feminists, but I'm not quite sure how you avoid the possibility, at least, that there might be different capacities. So those are my suggestions.
Could everyone hear the questions, or should I repeat them? Okay. Let me see if I can summarize them, and you can tell me if first, you're not sure you like my use of environmental matter. It seems wrong to call it matter. Yeah. That we ought to call it maybe social influence or something else. Yeah, it's not. I mean, games we play and friends we make are not matter in a metaphysical sense. Okay. I'm not happy with that. And I don't know if that's essential to your argument or not, to call it matter. Okay. It actually, I'll start with that one. I actually want to keep it. And part of the reason is, it seems to me that the hylomorphism with the nice balance between form and matter gives us an easy way to say form is the principle of equality, matter the principle of difference. And we can just divide it up nice and easily. And so long as we only put the human capacities on the level of form, then we can insist that there is truly a principle of equality that's not compromised by any other formal element. And it does seem to me that the environment is material in the broadly Aristotelian sense. Now, I know he doesn't talk about it that way, but none of our matter is just prime matter. We eat pizza. Pizza's already formed matter. It has form to it, but it's material insofar as we take it in and form it into ourselves. And it seems to me analogously that the books we read work in the same way. If we don't call them material, I think there's a temptation to think of matter just as stuff. This is formed matter. It's not just matter. And it can function in a material way in relation, not to too many forms here, but at least food can function in a material way in relation to human beings. So I worry first that if we don't call the environmental matter matter, that will encourage a misunderstanding of matter for Aristotle. And that secondly, it messes up our nice little neat division between the formal and the material influences, or the formal and the material principles.
What messes?
Once we start talking about other forms, I think we have trouble talking about the way we take in matter. It seems to me that the way we take in the books we read functions analogously to our higher capacities, to the way taking in food functions to physical growth.
Analogous, perhaps, but I wouldn't use the term. I mean, our friends have souls, they're human beings, their relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
They are substances themselves,
absolutely.
Matter and form.
Absolutely.
And friendship is not something material, it's the human relationship in the cultural. I don't know. I mean, you can use it. I just was wondering how important it is.
Your critique is right that it's different, so I need to emphasize the way in which it's different. I don't want to turn friends into just things I use. I'm not consuming friends like I'm consuming pizza. So you're right, there's a really important difference, but I don't want to give up the term. I guess
we're formed by culture, but we don't.
Yeah, we're not eating it in the same way.
The second point was about, I'm not, about the
capacity.
Whether you haven't necessarily, you speak of incentives, and I like that, but I'm not sure you've shown that there could not be some different capacities, that's all.
Okay. I like this question because her question is, have I shown that there really are no different capacities between women and men? Aren't there some different capacities? For example, the capacity to carry children for women that men don't have, as far as I can tell, in any real sense. Are there thus different capacities?
Or the facial perception stuff on
Right,
the brain
okay.
coming out. I don't have a
So the ways our brains work, the ways we take in facial perception. Once again, I don't want to go that way. I think we should make a distinction between abilities and capacities. Capacities as the fundamental potencies of soul versus abilities, i.e. given certain material circumstances, one can then actualize the potencies in different ways. But I don't want to give up on capacities being common to all human beings, because then one gives up the basis for equality. But I think you're right, we are going to have to say they get specified in quite specific ways. Our capacity, for example, is for reproduction. It's not for carrying children in a womb. The capacity proper with reproduction, the ability that women have, would be to carry a child in a womb, versus men have the reproductive capacity in a different way. But I guess I want to be careful about...
But women and men can have the same capacity, but women have it to a lesser degree, or is not perhaps capable of the same degree of development, or men...
Or the material
but
circumstances.
the basic thing is there. We all have spatial perception. It's a matter of how...
Right. And there I'd want to say the matter is what's making the capacity actualizable in different ways.
That there might be limits to, or some have stronger or weaker.
Right, yeah.
We'll need to keep the questions brief. Those are excellent questions. No, but you can't see there are many hands up. So for that reason, I think please try to be as brief as possible and one question per person until we're done. Okay,
this is one question. I'm going to use a concrete example to and ask you how your feminism, Aristotelian feminism, would deal with it. This is a firefighter example, okay? Women's bodies are different. They tend to be able to develop less body mass than men in general, but that varies because some women can, in fact. But even athletic women tend to have less body mass than men. Okay, so you have the firefighter profession, and so in general, you would say that any given point, that the determination of who should be a firefighter should be based on who can actually do the task, not on whether you are a man or a woman. In other words, it shouldn't be quoted either way or whatever, exclusions or inclusions either way. But my question is there an ethical imperative for the firefighter profession as a profession to develop their profession in such a way as to make women more able, like by emphasizing technology, for instance, so that the difference in body mass, muscle mass is not as important? Is there an ethical imperative in your Aristotelian feminism for the firefighter profession to move in, so therefore making whatever actual requirements there are for firefighting available to women as well as men? Or is it that there should be kind of just, the firefighter profession should develop in whatever way to make firefighting the best, and if that means hiring fewer women because they just can't do it, then that's what that means.
The question was about certain professions like firefighting. If women, because of a common being physically weaker, don't meet the requirements quite as frequently as men do, particularly in the profession, is there nonetheless an ethical imperative to encourage the profession to open its doors to more women and find ways to get women involved?
More specifically, to change the profession itself so that more women can, in fact, in other words, emphasize technology specifically for firefighting. Technology can overcome that difference
I think here would be a case-by-case question. If there is something about how the profession is done that women can offer certain strengths. So let's say, I don't know if this is true, but let's say that women tend to develop attention to fragile human life with more subtlety than men. I don't know if that's actually true, but let's say that tends to be a strength of women, and it would be advantageous for the firefighting profession to be more attentive in certain ways. Then it might be imperative that firefighting change in order to incorporate the strengths of women. But it depends on, I think there can be several factors with differing professions whether there'd be that imperative or not. So it's not a satisfying answer.
Phenomenology. Talk about that. I can see how it would help, but we're talking about there are real things out there, and we respond to the
So where do I begin?
Aristotelian phenomenology, could you say, is it such a thing?
I think there are lots of debates on how to interpret Aristotle. I think that Aristotle is implicitly a phenomenologist. That is, his approach begins with our operations and ways of being related to the real, not as explicitly, certainly, as cultural and contemporary phenomenology, but nonetheless beginning with an account of the operations by which we are in touch with and communion with the real, and then developing a metaphysics that grows out of his account of the ways in which we're in touch with the real. So I think that implicit in Aristotle's metaphysics is a phenomenology, but I'll admit that's a highly debated point, and it's certainly not explicit in Aristotle.
I want to move it. I think it makes sense.
Oh, good.
I think what some feminists would argue is that, of course, there are significant biological, material differences and differences of ability between men and women, but that the mistake is in thinking of those sorts of differences as being themselves different in kind from all the other ways in which individual human beings are different from each other. And that the job of a theory of equality with regard to all differences is to, at least as much as possible, abstract away from what would otherwise be fairly obvious differences. So I guess my question for you is, do you see to distinct, in your larger account of equality, you see the differences that you've identified between men and women as being distinctive and requiring a special sort of sub-theory of equality, as opposed to all the other myriad ways in which human beings are different from each other?
So then the question is, are gender, or at least sex differences, more significant than just plain individual differences? I certainly think we need an account of individual differences, and I think any account of gender needs to take individual differences seriously. But it does seem to me that we can't just jump from the category of individual to human, that sex differences matter more than that. And I think the structure of the ways in which we reproduce, but not only that. I mean, I think that's the most obvious, but I think they're much more comprehensive than that, and cross-cultural. So I guess I do want to hold on to an important difference between women and men, and not just individual differences. Gosh. Go to the back of the room, in a gray shirt. Yeah.
I have a question about your claim that capacities, or human capacities, strictly speaking, are neither male nor female. I was wondering how willing you would be to hold, because it seems like you're going to be logically, and you should be willing to say that analogously in the lower animals. And I was wondering if you are, and then also if that isn't a problem. If you say all spiderly capacities are neither male nor female, it sounds wrong because it's protecting the species is the highest goal of the animal nature. How can you say that fundamentally how that's done is accidental, which seems like what you're concluding? Because gender is looking accidental rather than essential, right? And
it's on the side of matter, not necessarily accident. So form and matter together make up the substance, and then the accident here in the substance. So I'd say it's at the substantial level, not accidental level. But you're right, even in animals, I'd have to say something like the reproductive capacities are among the highest of certain animals. But I wouldn't want to say the male or female capacities, but the reproductive that are then specified for spiders in a certain kind of way, in contrast to, I don't know, plankton or anything else. I don't know how plankton reproduce. What are they just, so that, yes.
I can slightly hear the presence of another Aristotelian feminist in the discussion, that being Ada Stein, who also used this distinction to inform and that's it. And I'm just wondering, sort of without going too far off into Stein's direction, you could just, for a point of clarification, draw a contrast between your position, particularly on the matter of form, the matter of form, but on Stein's position on that in the operation.
work on Stein is certainly what got me into this topic. As far as I can tell, though, Stein certainly accepts a broadly Thomistic distinction between form and matter, but what she does that I think is rather interesting and wrong is she puts gender on the side of form and not matter. She claims not that there are sort of souls different in kind, but she thinks that feminine souls have a different cast to their humanity than masculine souls. And so she wants to put femininity and masculinity more on the side of form than I want to.
Can you explain why you don't want to do that?
Sure. It's actually tied to many, many factors, one of which is that she's, I think in the end, a scotist more than a Thomist on the nature of essence. And so because she has a downplaying of, I think, the dignity of matter, she feels a pressure to put that which has dignity closer to form than a Thomist would. And I think an Aristotelian and a Thomist sees greater dignity to matter, sees essence as a limitation of, or sees essence not as a thing of it in itself, but a limitation of act. And thus it's the emphasis on actuality and on matter, the dignity of matter, that I think makes the Thomist position distinctive in contrast with Scotus. In the jacket over here.
She sort of got my question a little bit, but if you could clarify maybe the distinction between sex and gender, particularly I'm thinking about it in light of the fact that freedom is always embodied, and what the relation, or how freedom plays itself out in light of the distinction between sex and gender. Does that make sense? I mean, because as I act, I'm always acting as a man, right? And therefore, there seems to be a close relationship between sex and gender. So no matter what gender I want to be or act out, I mean, I'm a man, and I can only be that such that any action is always going to be qua man, albeit perverted by wanting to be a woman.
I think this is one of the places where the distinction between sex and gender gets to be a little fuzzy. It is a distinction and not a separation. The claim is not that sex is separated from gender, but that you can distinguish in some way that which is more directly determined by biology from the ways in which we live out that which we've been given through our biological matter. But I'll grant you that it's a rough distinction. So I think your acting as a male is in fact a gendered action because you are acting with an understanding of yourself as a male. But the maleness per se would be something given to you, and we know of cases where a child was told he was not a male, that he was female, and thus was presumably trying to act as female, even though that wasn't the given sex. So I think we can make some kind of distinction, but I'll grant as lived out, we don't separate them.
You've been very hesitant to make any, sort of say that there are any concrete differences at this point. So I wonder if you could tell us what the future holds in terms of theoretical research or scientific research or what it is, or if we ever can say that there are any concrete differences. It seems to me that you're not there yet. Can we ever say it? Are you sort of agnostic on it? Or is there actual work that can be done to get us there?
I do think we can get there. But I think there are an awful lot of things that need to be gotten correctly in place in order to get there rightly. I think, for example, sheer empirical studies aren't going to be overly helpful until we have a right understanding of the relative significance of biological versus environmental factors. If you just count how kids behave in preschool, well, is it because of environment? Is it because of social pressure? Is it because of... and it seems to me that we can begin to articulate models of what we might be looking for, and then create studies that could then confirm those models in various ways. We can begin looking at the biological differences, asking the kinds of influences those might have, and then find studies that might sort of confirm or not. But I think we need to have studies that are pretty sensitive to all the differing possibilities, and I'm not sure that most of our empirical studies are yet that. Now, some of them are going to be truly helpful, but I don't know that most of them are yet that. So I guess I'd want to take the empirical data as an important part of how you figure it out, but not the only part.
Sarah, I have a question relating to trade-offs, the idea you can't have it all. Seems to me you've talked a lot about possibilities and what we can do. Should we also be talking about should we do? I'm a physician, spent a long number of years as a physician, and when I started off, the profession was mainly men, and the nursing profession was mainly women. And I think the roles were very stereotyped in a sense. Now, of course, there are many of both sexes in nursing and the medical profession. And again, I don't know, but I'm just saying this is an observation that I have. It seems to me the man that I see in nursing and the women that I see in medicine, I can see distinct differences, characteristics, than what I would traditionally have thought. As an example, I don't find female physicians as nurturing as the wonderful female nurses that I knew when I was younger. I mean, they're gone. And so, if what I'm thinking and observing as some reality, should we be thinking about, is this what we want to do? Because I think we've gained something, but we've also lost something. No, and that's sort of Aristotelian too.
I'm not sure that this will, were you finished? I'm not sure that this will quite answer your question, but one of the things I am concerned about is that we need to value the full range of human capacities, and that as a society, by and large, at least in most professions, we have tended to value the more masculine abilities and encouraged women to develop strengths in those, and they're human abilities. Women ought to. But it's not clear that we've always valued as a society the human abilities that women sometimes develop more easily. So in part it may be that our professions aren't fully human yet. And so long as they're not, we're encouraging development in both women and men that isn't yet fully human.
That sort of brings my question. I don't see within your model where nurturing is given any value. And, obviously that's a capacity that men and women both share. As you mentioned, reproduction is a capacity shared. But for women, if you're looking at a global perspective or a more individual perspective, where in your model are you seeing, with human development, evaluating those things?
And this is where I haven't done a whole lot. And I think I would want to put it among the human capacities that we need to develop. I tried to give examples that included developing our affective and emotional lives. But you're right, I haven't yet listed what counts as human versus non-human capacities. What are the distinctively core human capacities we ought to be developing? And I haven't listed them, but I'd certainly want to list our affective, our nurturing, our attention to personal and human development as among those capacities.
I'm talking basic. I'm talking about breastfeeding babies and the advantages to that, and whether or not a society can even allow it with the direction we're taking.
And that's where I think biological differences matter in a way that feminists haven't taken seriously.
Yeah, well, that's what I
Yeah,
said.
I absolutely agree.
Reality, if you're talking about Aristotle's get real.
This is my weakness as a theorist, but you're absolutely right. That's what I'm talking about. Bodies matter immensely, and that we can't just. but absolutely, including quite simple things like breastfeeding and the attention one gives to children in that kind of way.
How about one more question?
Okay.
Make a distinction as an analogy that you think of gender as biology as the matter and humanity as a form almost, and then considering that it creates, as the first question, kind of this problem of calling them environmental or cultural factors matter. And I'm wondering if a different way to think about it is bringing in Aristotelian causation and using Thomistic terminology, material, formal, efficient, and final, and then thinking of our biology with regard to our sex as a material cause, but with regard to our gender as an efficient cause. And then you think of environmental or cultural factors as efficient causes as well, insofar as they kind of act on you and inform your gender. Would that seem to work?
I hadn't thought of going this way. Let me think about it. My first reaction, and this may not actually be right once I think through it, my first worry is I wouldn't want to make gender just an efficient and not also in part a final, but I think it's a final cause in a different way than humanity would be, or human would be a final cause. So I'm a little unsure how we'd parse out where they'd all fit, but you might be right that would be crucial to filling it out with more nuance.
Thank you. Well, now the conference adjourns to lunch. It's very important for our material well-being.